That $4 billion sort of sounds familiar. It sounds like the price of a pipeline. Is that approximately interesting? In fact, there's a very good survey done by Forbes of global attitudes to climate change, and it shows that 56% of people globally think we have a shot at addressing climate change, which is very interesting to some of our attitudes compared to some of our attitudes in Canada. However, unfortunately, there's a large number of primarily young people who think we're doomed, and even though we have the technology, we don't have the political will, and we may not be able to do it. So we're hoping that that does not paralyze our young people, because we need their support to get change made in this country. Now, our next speaker is Scott Vaughan, who I have admired for many years now, since Elizabeth Dowdeswell introduced us. And as she introduced him as a person of integrity, with clear analysis and charm. Here he is. Thank you.
Thank you again. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll talk, I'm going to touch on four things. So one is Paris. The second is jobs. The third is, again, Dale just raised the issue of subsidies. And then the fourth is questions around trade, and partly just because I'm going to the WTO next week, and so I can rehearse some of the things that I'm going to be talking about at the WTO forum. But I wanted to begin with Paris. And there's been a whole bunch of iconic photos that came out of the December meeting. This is one with the French Prime Minister and Christina Figueres, the head of the UNCCC Secretariat. And this has been viewed rightly as a historic breakthrough in having collective action in order to address the urgency of climate change. And so there's been tremendous amount of hope on what Paris 3 years later, whether it's delivering upon those promises. And so what I wanted to do is just to talk a little about where we are, and then being careful that Paris does not give us a false sense of hope. And I'll begin by saying, Dale just mentioned the ozone layer. The Montreal Protocol has been viewed as one of the most successful international environmental treaties ever. And when you compare that to Paris, you can see the differences and the experiment that Paris has brought us to. So Montreal Protocol began with a small group of industrialized countries. It focused on one specific pollutants, which then enlarged from CFCs to a group of ozone-depleting substances. It then had targets, so that if you were a signatory to Montreal, you had a target related to the level of emissions reductions, elimination, as well as all sorts of rules related to how you coordinated the elimination, both of production and consumption, banning trade, and setting up, not as a voluntary measure, but a fund to help developing countries. And then there were measurable targets with tracking in order to see how you were going from here to there, working with Gordon and other people from the international science community. And that architecture basically has been the architecture of around 200 different international environmental agreements. It's state-centered action based on targets, timetables, commitments, tracking, monitoring, verification, reporting, adjustment, and financing. So Paris was very different. Paris is very different. Paris began because, for those of you that remember, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 said we've got to begin action. We're going to begin with industrialized countries. We will begin with a target, and the target will be reported in 2020. And that did not move, Kyoto didn't move forward. Canada was the first and only country to pull out of an international treaty in the Harper government. But what the difference between when Kyoto was, and that model of international treaty setting, and today, among them is China. So China, Brazil, South Africa, India, et cetera. And so you are having this sort of fight between rich countries, large emitters, and the rest of the world. So where Paris, the architecture is really new, was to say, let's do a couple things. One, we won't have targets related to what countries are obliged to do. So any country, and in the case of Paris, almost 190 countries signed, any country will do any measure that they think is going to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. And so just think of that. If all of you in this room decided that you were going to adopt a carbon pricing and you were going to do a cap and trade between the three countries, and there was going to be a regulation, there were going to be standards, you then run into one of the basic problems that Paris is now facing, was that because it was all inclusive, because it's bottom up, because all countries are encouraged to act, you have that sense of collective responsibility. But what Paris doesn't have is the architecture. And this is really important. So in the last 2 years, they are arguing over things which seem really arcane, and indeed they are, but basic accounting standards. So whether my estimation of what a ton of greenhouse gas emissions avoided is the same as yours. And there's not an agreement on that. And the agreement is the time on running out of this is coming up really quickly, meaning in December, the countries will meet in Poland, and they don't have a basic architecture around monitoring, reporting, and verification. And guess what? Like all things, this is not technical, it's political, because what Paris also included is an obligation or a promise for all countries, developed and developing, low income, middle income, high income, to work together. But at the same time, what Paris included, which is in all UN language, this common and differentiated responsibility. So China, for example, will say, well, we're going to act, but we're not going to set a target for our reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. We'll have a peak carbon, but we're not going to put a number to it. And until just about a month ago, there was discussion about whether or not there would be 2 or 3 different accounting standards for what a ton is. To me, this is just really worrying. And it's worrying because whether or not the gamble of Paris is going to pay off, because the stakes are so high. So there's lots of signs of progress, and I'll just give you a couple. So one is, and I think Dale and colleagues this morning, there's more global investment in clean energy and renewable energy now than there is in fossil fuel. In 2017, again, about $170 billion invested in renewable energy, and that's overshadowed new investment in fossil fuels. China is the biggest producer and exporter of renewable energy, led by solar. But you're seeing now a whole second generation of countries, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, who are now importing and using renewable energy. But what's really, really interesting is what is the innovative side of the Paris agenda, which is, the sort of the unit of account, as Al Gore would say, the unit of accountability at the international level is with states. So in the case of Canada, Ottawa will go and represent all of Canada in the UN. What Paris said is, climate is way too big to rely only on formal federal governments. And so what Paris has opened up is action from state level, from sub-federal, from different coalitions, as well as the private sector. And I'm just going to give you 4 examples of those categories. So within the state level, we're having a huge debate in Canada around carbon pricing. There are 88 countries now around the world that are using carbon pricing. And when I say countries, I mean within the country. So in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo have carbon pricing and carbon taxation. There's different experiments here in Quebec and California around the WCI on a cap and trade system, with the one that Doug Ford shut down in Ontario. There are examples of regulatory approaches. There are examples of using green buildings, of transportation, of agriculture, and those are happening at the state level, at the provincial level here in Canada, at the city level with mandating, for example, low energy or zero carbon buildings, green transportation, carbon sequestration or green spaces within urban centers, et cetera. The list goes on and on at the sort of the jurisdictional government and sub-federal levels. But the other one, and somebody mentioned this morning, and it's the role of the private sector. And I just wanted to say that what we're seeing now is a whole bunch of different promises, commitments from the private sector on driving down greenhouse gas emissions. And some of them, frankly, are greenwash. But some of them are because the private sector is now increasingly worried about the material bottom line risk which climate change is posing. And somebody mentioned Mark Carney this morning. So Carney chaired the FSB, which I don't even remember now, the Thank you. For the Financial Stability Board. Thank you. And within that, he then set up a task force on climate risk disclosure, which was chaired by Mike Bloomberg. And they came out and said that climate change risk should be thought of from a financial perspective as any other type of risk, as an asset risk, as bubbles within the housing market, et cetera. And therefore, banks are increasingly looking at who are they financing, how much climate exposure do those companies that they're bankrolling have, and they will report on it. And so last year in Paris, President Macron hosted a summit. There was a commitment by among the largest financing in the world, BlackRock, Goldman's and others, that they are going to now watch the 100 largest emitters by company in the world and report on what that means in terms of climate risk. And this is now slowly moving markets. So Exxon, that funded fake science for 20 years, last week signed up and said, we better get on board, and we now believe in climate action. And so they're putting a pittance of their profits, but about $300 million to look at climate solutions. But this climate risk liability is now moving markets. And the big question is it going to be fast enough? I think as Gordon said, and we're really lucky, Gordon is really one of the preeminent climate scientists in the world. I mean, as Gordon said, the promise of Paris is to keep well below 2 degrees and to hit 1.5. No one believes right now that Paris is going to even reach 3 degrees. And so the peak on this, the window of opportunity, in order to get at the 2 degrees is now quickly closing. And some are saying by 2020, and whether or not there's a shift in terms of moving those emissions down. And where we are now is that there's an increase in 2017, a rise again in greenhouse gas emissions. But what I wanted to say, and I'll leave the Paris side just with this slide, is that in addition to CO2 emissions, and we think of oil and gas, and we think of the energy sector, there's a whole range of other, and you can't see it, and I can't see it, and it's my slide. But I think among those other areas of low-hanging fruit, one is called short-lived climate pollutants. Can we get things like methane, black carbon, and 8 CFCs out of the atmosphere? And it's a low cost, and the potential of that action can bring down global warming by as much as 0.6 degrees Celsius. But also, you can see within the sectors on this, deforestation globally comprises about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's touching on agriculture, upon transport, on electricity and energy systems. And it just underscores that doing this as a single window area of action is not going to get us to the comprehensive approach that we talked about. So the other 3 points I really just quickly wanted to touch upon in addition to Paris. So the first thing is jobs. And just to say, Shannon Phillips, the Minister of Environment of Alberta, was in Paris, and she said, the thing we forgot in Paris and talking about driving down emissions, building up clean power, looking at how we protect our ecosystems, we forgot to talk about jobs. And I think that's absolutely right. We've been working, my colleagues in the International Institute of Sustainable Development, we're starting around issues like just transition. This is not an aspirational goal. I mean, it is, but the term actually is now embodied in the International Labour Organization. The ILO adopted it a couple of years ago. So how do we think about jobs within the climate perspective? How do we, and I think the sort of the clear sort of conclusion, it's not going to be a one-to-one. It's not going to be for every coal job that's lost, there's going to be a new job in solar, for example. So thinking about this in a wider industrial strategy or industrial policy perspective is really important. And one of the groups that we've been working with is the European Commission, and they've been thinking about jobs, low carbon pathways in the context of something which is not familiar in Canada, but called circular economy. And how do you think about opportunities in mature economies for taking the things that we're throwing out and using those as value in order to shrink carbon footprints to create new jobs. And so in the European Commission, they projected 3 to 5 million jobs in the next 2 years just on a circular economy approach. And so Canada is starting a little of this. It was talked about in the G7. But what I wanted to talk about is something that Mike was great at advertising his work. One thing that we've been doing is, to me, the structural problems that we're facing, this cognitive dissonance that Dale talked about, part of it is because we're looking at what we measure. And so one of the things I've been really interested in, an economist for a long time, is GDP. And everybody around here will watch every month what Canada's GDP is. And that is viewed from every head of government, from every minister of finance around the world as the indicator of a country's health. And it's not. It was not. The architect of GDP is an economist named Kuznets, and he said, GDP is important for measuring one thing, which is income that has happened. And Robert Kennedy said GDP is good for measuring everything except what we care about. And so there's been work around beyond GDP, and one of the things that we've been doing is something called comprehensive wealth. We'll be launching a new report here in Ottawa at the end of October. Again, you'd all be invited. It's based on a framework with an economist in Cambridge called Das Gupta. And what the story that we did from a report from 2 years ago, it's going to be updated. But when you think about how do we measure our national health or well-being, there's sort of 4 clusters. So one is how we value humans or human capital. The second is natural capital. The third is social capital. And the fourth is produced capital. And in Canada, we have a real problem because we have a real structural problem, which is why a pipeline becomes a constitutional national crisis. Because in the last 30 years, Canada's economic growth has been, as we all know, has been fueled by a drawing down on our natural resources. But for the first time, we know how much, and it's been by 25%. So Canada's natural capital has been reduced by 25% in the last 30 years. And this is based not on speculation or modeling, it's based on statistical evidence drawing from Stats Canada. And then from the second, on produced capital. Canada's sort of cluster of produced capital, 70% goes into 2 areas. One is oil and gas, and the second is housing. So you think 2 bubbles. Carney called carbon a bubble, and then it just came out 2 days ago that Canada has 2 housing bubbles, which actually now are becoming more and more precarious. But the third one, just think about jobs, and it's human capital. And when you think about all the investments, all you've done for your children in investing in education, in skills growth, and others, when you look at Canada's trend on human capital in the last 30 years, it's an absolute flat line. That Canada has not increased its ability to compete in the 21st century knowledge economy, and part of it is because we're still locked into our reliance on a natural resource economy. And so, to me, this question about how do we think about jobs and how do we think about oil and gas versus our climate commitments, to me gets at sort of an underlying structural problem with our Canadian economy. And I think I don't have an answer for it, but we're going to be updating this at the end of this month. So the last thing I just wanted to mention was the World Trade Organization. I'm just really thankful to our colleague for raising it. I'm going next week. I used to work in the WTO. I think the role of WTO is limited but important in this. And I think there are 3 areas. So one is this role of subsidies that Dale had mentioned. The WTO has rules for disciplining subsidies. In the context of fossil fuel subsidies around the world, the same governments that have said that they're going to accelerate implementation of Paris, every year spend $500 billion on subsidizing the fossil fuel sector. Most of that is in developing countries, and most of that is around consumption subsidies. And you think, okay, well, let's make sure that we have subsidies that are pro-poor. But our colleagues, we have a whole program that have been working on this for 10 years. Most of the subsidies that are delivered in developing countries are actually not pro-poor. They go to middle-income families to help for them, for example, for driving their cars. And so the opportunity to look at the consumption side while making sure that you're actually not leaving out the most vulnerable, there's a lot of work underway with the OECD and others that we've been, as I said, we've been doing this for a long time. The second one is the role of WTO in looking at environmental goods and services. And I mentioned So renewable energy, the total trade in renewable energy has increased exponentially in the last 5 years, 6 years. The average cost of solar has dropped by 70%, largely because of China. What you want to do is to have that freeing up as quickly as possible, meaning having no tariffs and no non-tariff measures on this. When I worked at the WTO 20 years ago, we were talking about how you were going to get carving out a list of environmental goods and services that would actually be accelerated because of no tariff barriers. And today, they're still talking about it. They're still arguing about what the list should be, what should be in the list, what should not be in the list, making sure the list includes exports from developing countries like sustainable commodities. And so, there's a time to move on this, and Canada just signed the CETA agreement, and so that's one of the areas where I think it would be important to look at. And then the last one is just around the taxes. And I think I agree with you, is that I think border tax adjustment is coming and will be coming, and I think the WTO can provide some orderly approach to it. So the last thing I'll end with is just, this is really, really contentious in Canada. In a way, the politics of climate and the politics of pipelines is becoming, increasingly divisive. I was in the House Finance Committee this week, and we gave testimony, and we talked about, based on the great work that Andrew has been doing on the Green Budget Coalition, so we talked about Canada's fossil fuel subsidies. And in Canada, it's about $2 billion a year. About 200 million of it is from federal subsidies. Most of it is tax treatment to encourage companies to find yet more undiscovered oil and gas in more and more further deposit, offshore and in the Arctic, et cetera. So the other witness there was CAP from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And so we had a disagreement on, whether these are good, whether these are not good, et cetera. And to me, that's a healthy part of what should happen in the House of Commons. But what I thought was startling, and it's just to remember where we are now, is that in the questions, one of the opposition members of Parliament, who you can probably guess from which party, asked me when I said, I think that Canada has made a promise in G20 to cut down its fossil fuel subsidies. The question I got was, where does your funding come from? And to me, this is really, really worrisome. And this is more than we can have legitimate arguments about, how fast, what's the transition, how long should this take, how urgent, et cetera. But we need to remember, and Mike DeSouza was really one of the extraordinary heroes in this, that these days when people were saying, we're going to shut you down because we think that you're representing views that we do not like and from outside of Canada, this is really, really fundamentally dangerous to our democracy. So with that, I'll thank Susan and thank you all.